So today I'm going to be covering, like Jason mentioned, how we use test automation as a whole, which also includes CDRouter, of course. But I'm going to be talking a little bit about how within Deutsche Telekom and specifically within our RDK program, how we use test automation and how we take those insights and try and get this cycle going of continuous test feedback. So first of all, I'll start off with how we're kind of structured within our software development. So our team is predominantly working on RDK-B devices. You'll see here there's some reference to RDK-F. That simply just stands for our team name, which is RDK Factory. It's not an uncommon way that we're structured, I think. So we're structured into a few different verticals, which are defined. So that is the kind of requirements and demand planning, the build, which is everything that is to do with software development. So the platform bring up, the maintenance, the RDK middleware development, and everything that goes along with the actual feature development. Then we move into test, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today. And I'll go into more detail, but in a short view, that covers everything from build acceptance testing, smoke, regression, and specialized tests as well. And in addition to that, after that kind of first process is done, we also have a section for UAT and end-to-end testing as well. And then finally, we come on to the release management and deploy kind of area of our team, which goes into NatCo support as well. If we look a little bit closer into the testing structure, I'm sure a lot of you may be familiar already with this triangle. It's quite a common testing pyramid that is followed. But essentially what I'm trying to show here is that the scale of testing as you go through the process does change a little bit. So right at the bottom, you've got your unit testing. And generally, this is where you see lots of small, quick tests where your automation tends to be a lot higher and therefore tends to be kind of less costly and quicker to run. And then your component testing as well. Now, within our team, we classify these two areas as our system test area, which is where we really focus on delivering automated test results back to the development team using CI/CD pipelines for that continuous feedback on new modules. Then as you come up a little bit higher into the triangle, you'll see here that obviously as a triangle, it kind of tapers in. And this is where we see maybe a little bit more focused testing. So we want to validate if the components and the modules are all still behaving as we expect when we integrate them all into the system. So this can comprise of compound testing, where you're running scenarios in conjunction with each other, and also exploratory testing as well. Then you come up further into the real kind of point of the triangle, where you're going from your UI and API testing, and then finally your manual and exploratory testing. Now, this is where we really see that the whole system is tested for acceptability. So verification that the system is ready to be delivered to the customer. And as you might expect, when we get to this point, there are fewer scenarios, but they are a lot larger. And therefore, although sometimes they can be automated, for the majority, they do tend to be more manual, and therefore they can be more costly and also slower to run. And this is where you typically, well, in our case anyway, and I'm sure a lot of you on the call as well, where you typically tend to integrate your CPU firmware along with things like your backend, your apps, your entertainment and TV infrastructure as well. So this is where we kind of highlight everything together as it would be delivered to a customer. And where we use CDRouter actually covers quite a few elements of this, because it's quite flexible in the way that we can use it. So we can use it right the way from that really base unit testing all the way up to integration testing. And I'll come on to a little bit later exactly what we use CDRouter for. Our outlook for quality assurance within 2023 has kind of been governed by three guiding principles. So the first one is speed. So obviously, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this as well. Speed really is of the essence here. We really want to decrease that time to market. We're continually getting more builds because we want that feature development to be a lot faster and smoother, and to allow the development teams to get more feedback. And we also have a lot more on our hands, right? So this is where speed and also scale come into this. So the scale part really being that as we continue to perform our software development, the scale really becomes the point where we have to make sure that everything that we're building, we're not having to repeatedly build that for every new device we introduce. We want to make sure that our setups are as simple, and this is where I come on to simplicity. We want to make sure they're simple enough that we can then replicate them quite easily where we need to. So there are three guiding principles: speed, scale, and simplicity. And we are trying to apply these to three particular focus areas. So the first is continued test automation development. And this is really clear to see how these three guiding principles fit in here. Secondly, stability testing. So, within an RDK-B landscape and within a broadband landscape as a whole, stability is one of the key things. If we take ourselves as customers, right, it's one thing to have great performance from your router, but also you need it to have that stability behind it. You don't want it to be having to reboot every day, week, even month. You want it to have that longevity behind it, and therefore stability testing is something that's really important to our customers, and also to us as well, of course, to make sure that our products are robust. And finally, the build-up of our Wi-Fi and mesh test coverage. So as I'm sure a lot of you are also focusing on, this is an area where there's this continual build-up within a customer ecosystem. It's always building, and when we need to make sure that the test coverage there is sufficient to meet as many of the customer scenarios as we can. So if I come on to a little bit about how we test. So we actually have two labs, but we call it as one lab, two locations, because really we kind of treat them as brothers or sisters, as you will. They come from the same family, they have the same values, they have the same roots within them, but they're just simply in different locations. And our labs are both enabled with lots of different access technologies, such as DSL, fiber, cable, and also 5G. We're also looking to expand into DOCSIS as well at some point. And these two labs are kind of on the other ends of the world. So one in Germany, near Frankfurt, and one in Bangalore in India. However, we have this common team that helps us drive commonality through the two labs. And why this is really important to us is that finding the defects as early on in the development stage as possible means that they could be fixed quickly. And as I mentioned earlier on, reducing the time to market and increasing the focus that we can put on validating the end-to-end customer experience, the better quality products we're going to get at the end of the day. So that's really our focus here. If I talk a little bit about our test automation, so our test automation spans 4 different frameworks. So if I start with TDK, so for those that aren't aware, TDK and I'll consider automatics in this as well, are both open source frameworks in which that we have taken contributions from a central community and also contributed back as well. And they really help us to validate more of the kind of low level areas of our code. Then we also are using CDRouter quite heavily, as I mentioned earlier. And also we have one additional framework here, which is Cujo, which is specifically looking at one of our security frameworks. And how this fits together is that we are using automatics as an overall orchestrator. And we have lots of different elements coming into this, but what's really nice about the 4 frameworks that we are using is they fit in really nicely together. So if I talk a little bit about automatics first of all, we have a number of elements here that are coming directly into automatics. So as I mentioned earlier, there are native scripts that are developed in there. You'll see here that there are some little sound timers here where we're still in the process of implementing them, but I wanted to showcase it as a whole. So there's also a new feature where we can directly integrate Python scripts here. We've got voice testing going on. We have Candela, which is a specific Wi-Fi testing tool. And also there's a new feature that's just been launched called scriptless testing as well. Then we have Cujo and TDK, for which we're both using a robot framework to integrate those into the automatics orchestrator. And finally, CDRouter. Now, what we have with CDRouter is that it is a very good standalone platform. For those of you that have used it will know that. But also, I believe, and one of the QA Cafe team can correct me later on if there's been any changes to this. But also, the QA Cafe team are working on integrating this with automatics as well, which makes it really nice for us as a customer because it all sits under one framework then. And we're also using a couple of add-ons to the CDRouter, one of them being AmariSoft, which is how we test some of our cellular products as well. And what's really nice is that it then is all integrated, right? So we have everything kind of under one roof, as it were. And what's nice is that it's all integrated into our CI/CD pipeline as well as an automated test execution. Now, if I talk specifically about what we're using CDRouter for at RDK Factory. So the first thing we use it for is our standard kind of build validation. Now, CDRouter allows us the kind of flexibility to adjust the test packages as we see fit. So whether we're doing testing on a nightly build, whether it's a weekly build, or whether we're doing it for a more extensive sprint validation, we can change the package that we are using to make sure that we're getting the most value out of the testing we're doing. So for a nightly build, for example, we might just want to test the very kind of basic features to ensure that there's been no regressions introduced from the new feature merges. When we get to the weekly builds, that's where we maybe want to go into a little bit more detail to make sure that the performance is looking good. And then finally, when we get into the sprint validation, and this is our final build that we would deliver to our customer, this is where we want to have that much wider validation and make sure that as a whole, the testing is looking, or the build is looking at sufficient quality that we can deliver it to a customer. And what's also nice is that, for our use case, we have a lot of different NATCOs that we are targeting, and sometimes they have slightly different configuration files or slightly different features that they have deployed within them. So what's nice is that we can easily modify the configuration files and perhaps have more than one per device if we need to. So for example, if we have one router that's being used in 3 different countries, and therefore they have 3 different partner IDs, for instance, we can customize them to make sure that we are getting the right test cases done for each country, which is really beneficial for us. Secondly, we use CDRouter for on-demand troubleshooting. So let's say either within this build validation or externally, we have encountered an issue and we want to debug it or find out more, troubleshoot it basically. What CDRouter allows us to do is that it's very easy and quick to spin up a test setup because there's already a pre-existing list of test cases of which we can pick in as we see fit for whatever the problem might be. We can go and pick those and run a specific set of test cases very, very quickly to be able to get a better understanding of what's going on what the behavior is looking like. So we can focus in on those specific areas and run more intensive testing. And this has really helped us, when we've seen an issue, but perhaps aren't quite sure on the root cause, or we've seen an issue and we want to know if it is wider spread than maybe we initially thought. This allows us to kind of get those answers. And finally, on the trend analysis part, so what we really are keen on is making sure that from one build to the next, we want to see that either the amount of the quality is either being maintained or improving. Of course, that's what we're really aiming for here. So therefore, the dashboards within CDRouter allow us to see those results trends and also spot inconsistencies. So if they're, from build A to build B, if we see suddenly, hang on a second, that isn't quite the same as what happened here, and there was no other reason, there was nothing introduced in the software that would have caused that, it allows us to look into a little bit more detail and go back and retrospectively see, why might that have happened? And that links back to the on-demand troubleshooting I mentioned earlier. The future integration that is planned with automatics as well will allow us to compare against other frameworks. So the way that in which we use our frameworks is that they're targeting slightly different things, but of course there is some overlap a little bit in some of the areas. So allowing us to compare against frameworks really allows us to see at that deeper level, okay, does the result that we've seen within CDRouter, does that link back to the result that we've seen in this other framework? So that will help us as well. And also for the longer term validation, so for stability testing, for instance, if we have run a series of stability tests and it's, at a glance, sometimes if we didn't have a dashboard, it can be quite difficult to tell, okay, in this first run compared to this fourth run, what is the customer seeing? Is there any differences here that we've seen within the builds? And therefore the trend analysis part here is really super important, specifically in the stability testing, because obviously you have that longer period of time, much more results to look at, and therefore it's really important to be able to look and see if there's those trends that we can identify. I'll just go cover a little bit about how it's actually integrated within our pipeline. So you can see here, I know it's not maybe the prettiest slide in the world, but you can see here how we kind of use this within our pipeline. So there's a set of prerequisites, I suppose, where the build is discovered, the CPE is identified, and the CPE is reserved. Then we go ahead and install the firmware on that CPE. Then the testing process is triggered. We also are using kind of Slack to get quick kind of notifications on our results as well, mainly to just notify the testers involved whether the build is finished or not. Then the CPE is released, and then therefore the next process is ongoing. But how that looks in terms of CDRouter specifically is that within the pipeline, the testing info is kind of obtained first of all. Then we're using Jira to create that Jira execution, so we can easily track what's being tested. CDRouter is then enabled, and then this is where, as I mentioned earlier, we have different test packages depending on what we're trying to validate here. So in this example, this is a nightly validation, which would then be run. Then we finally upload the artifacts in terms of the test results, and then the result is torn down. So what makes it really nice is that it's really easy to integrate. So we're using GitLab here, but it's very easy to integrate within kind of our CI/CD flow. So the next part of my presentation is, okay, so we're doing all of this testing. What do we actually do with that feedback, and how do we make sure that the testing that we're doing is being fed back in a way that means that we are continually improving the software? So for us at DT, we need to understand what our metrics are. So what are the areas that we look at within our firmware that really tell us about the software quality? So this could be our CPE health, it could be on our DSL, it could be voice, Wi-Fi, GPON, or things that are non-trivial like temperature, for example. We then define a set of thresholds where we maybe say that for temperature, for example, we don't want to exceed either of these two areas, and patterns as well. So do we expect that there to be a certain pattern throughout the CP lifecycle do we expect that Wi-Fi will come up after X period of time? So we're also looking for those as well. And then finally, we define those thresholds into kind of like a ranking. So excellent, good, average, and poor. And our principles for the test feedback and the continuous integration is that, like I said, we identify the metrics and the data points that are relevant to each domain. So for those areas I mentioned earlier, underneath that, there'll be a whole series of areas that we would be looking at. And we're taking support also from our telemetry team here to make sure that we are, getting the most information that we can. But of course, here is really important for us to analyze our test playbook for matching test cases. So if I take Wi-Fi, for example, if there's a specific Wi-Fi throughput that we are expecting, we need to look back at our test playbook, whether that's within any of our frameworks, and see what those matching test cases are. Because what we want to do is, telemetry is one thing, but also we need to make sure that our testing that we're doing could also help us determine the health of our CP. Then, like I said, we derive these thresholds and patterns that characterize the metrics. That could be with regards to performance, stability, coverage, etc. And then we feed our findings into like a traffic light categorization, exactly like I mentioned earlier. Then, following from that, let's say we were running this, we were seeing that maybe Wi-Fi was not as good as we expected. From one build to the next, we were seeing suddenly a spike in temperature. We then need to plan our data-driven kind of use cases or new test cases as well, or even looking back at our test playbook and say, is there a certain combination of tests here that could help us to identify maybe where this problem sits? And we do that all in collaboration with our data product and telemetry teams. So how this looks, throughout our testing cycle. So exactly like I mentioned earlier, where we had the triangle, this is exactly the same, just represented in a slightly different way. So right the way from our nightly builds and tests, so our build acceptance testing, to then our main QA testing, NatCo, field trial, and then onwards to launch. And we want to monitor these KPIs all the way through that process, because what we don't want to do is think that everything is excellent and green, or magenta as we call it, in the nightly build stage. But then when you get to FUT, when you get to launch, suddenly we're seeing a decline there. So we really want to make sure through this whole process that we're seeing consistency of our metrics here. So this is where KPI gathering, monitoring, and the automatic evaluation infrastructure can really help us here. And what this would look like in a real kind of scenario is that we would have a series of dashboards where we're monitoring all of these different KPIs and looking over time. So you can see here we're going along the span of our testing and into FET and launch as well. And we can see here very, very clearly, are we seeing the thresholds? Are we seeing that we're seeing similar behavior within each of these areas here? And therefore we can then feed back into our testing process, and this is what helps us to make sure that we have that continual improvement in our testing, and definitely helps us within DT. So some of these we're still in the process of implementing. Actually, it's a really exciting time for us, in the sense that we want to really kind of take the next steps here in terms of implementing these kind of dashboards. But we're well on the way now, and I would very much encourage, whether you're looking at KPIs or otherwise, whether you're just looking at test results, having this comparison of build to build, or having this comparison even of CP to CP. Let's say you have two CPs that potentially are on paper very comparable, but you're seeing different behavior. I think, looking back at all of these results and having this historical database really can help to identify where perhaps there are problem areas and where perhaps there needs to be an increased focus on the development. So with that, I think I kind of flew through that. So at this point, I guess if there's any questions, then please feel free to ask. Or if you prefer not to do it now, if you prefer to reach out to me on LinkedIn or whatever, that's totally fine. But at this point,
A couple of things I wanted to share with people, and this will be related to some of my questions actually, because Sophie brought up stability testing, and I have a couple of follow-up questions about that. We've been talking about that a lot recently, so we have a stability testing series of articles that Matt, if any of you on the call have interacted with Matt Langlois before, he's very passionate about stability testing, and so it's some of his key insights in there. When we're talking about the RDK-B testing specifically, if you are doing any, if you are interacting with things in a DOCSIS environment, there's more details on how CDRouter sets up that environment using the DOCSIS add-on. If you don't already have it and you are testing DOCSIS devices, please check that out. In addition to that, there are a set of RDK-B test lists that are now part of the that are now part of the CDRouter release. So if you fire those up, a test list is basically like a shortcut to building a package, right? So it's a bunch of tests that we've selected for a specific reason. We have, the CDRouter top 100 and some Wi-Fi ones and stuff like that. But we have the RDK-B specific test cases for both IPv4 and IPv6 that they're running. And then I brought up our training link here because Brad actually goes into some really good detail on what to do if you are testing through a CMTS and how to get that set up. So you have CDRouter on one side, you have your DUT on the other side, and then you have to go through a CMTS or some other access concentrator, like an OLT, before you complete the loop. And so that I wanted to bring that up because it's kind of important to the testing that we're doing here. And then last but not least, as questions are coming in, I did want to bring up the Epic Melon podcast specifically because Sophie and I recorded one last week, and that will be out next week on Tuesday. So if you want to hear more from her, go there, subscribe, and you'll get it. That's the QA Cafe podcast.